Assalamu alaikum fam, hope you're doing well. So we're continuing our deep dive into Greek mythology. It's important in a sense of understanding symbolisms that come from it, understanding how those myths, their religion of the time, how that shaped that part of the world, and to understand their thinking, because through their myths, through their religion, you'll understand how certain consciousnesses came about, and also you'll just really have fun nerding out, I hope. So, in particular, there is this issue about how, the succession occurs. And what's interesting is that with all these different gods, right, they don't surrender power. What happens is they have to be overcome. So essentially, the younger gods that come from their parents have to be ingenious. They have to circumvent, to overthrow. Because apparently, the older gods, they don't lose their power as they age, and they will not voluntarily surrender, but they are locked into an unwinnable war, and essentially, basically, it's going to take something daring, something clever to outwit the other, which is interesting because they're not all knowing in this Greek pantheon. It is quite interesting how people back then, reading these stories, how did they go about thinking about their gods that they thought were real, which obviously we know they weren't, because God is one, and God has power over all things. But it is quite interesting how there's this sort of game going on. So, Ouranos, which is for sky, was created in sense by Gaia, Earth. And as we know, Ouranos and Gaia, they had children who were the Titans. Now, Ouranos, he tries to oppress his own children. So he doesn't want them to emerge into the light. He hides them away in the recesses of Gaia Earth when they are born. He stuffs them in there, right? So apparently the legend goes is that one day he tries to spread out, and Kronos jumps out and cuts off the genitalia of his father. Now, it is strange how Ouranos is known as blocking someone, right? He blocks. It's pretty sad that Ouranos would do that to its own offspring, right? Shows you the immorality. Just total, like, you're suppressing your own children, and it makes you wonder how, the father and son relationship would have been in ancient Greece if they're looking at, those who are going to inherit all their land, and how they would go about doing that. There must have been a lot of suspicion and intrigue because of this type of thinking beyond the normal means. So, what's funny and unique is that as Ouranos is bleeding, each spot, like the semen and the blood, it generates life. So, it inseminates Gaia, and out of that comes the Furies, the Erinyes, nymphs, giants, and such. They come into being because of that. But the most unique part, which is important, is as the entire organ itself, gets into one location, that fertilizes so heavily that out springs Aphrodite. And Aphrodite is used a lot in pop culture. She is mentioned in songs, and she literally came straight from the male organ. So I do think it's funny that Aphrodite comes from her father's castration, and from her, essentially, what would you call that, like a family member, making her father into a eunuch. So it's a very weird type of birth, right? She goes into Gaia Earth. She's there, like essentially her essence or something. and her father's gets gutted, and the entire organ goes on, and it's so potent, it's so fertile that everything can grow from it, and she comes out. So she's created because of a castration. And the castration is man to man, right? Kronos did it to his father. So it's a weird, they would be brother and sister then, in a weird way. Kronos is the son of Ouranos, and Aphrodite would be the son of Ouranos as well. So Aphrodite only comes into existence because her brother decided to punish Ouranos so that he could get into the light, so he could, escape his imprisonment. I mean, wow. And if you think about it, is that justice in a sense? Because Ouranos was holding his own children back, and Kronos had to spring out and do something bold. And he used a sickle that was made of adamant, which is apparently very strong. So, wow, it's interesting. And then because he did that, nymphs were created. Now, it's interesting, the nymphs, because nymphs are used in common language as women who are can't really control themselves, and they enjoy intimacy too much. And they're usually portrayed as a temptation and a bit mischievous and naughty. You can see some, weird paintings of the satyrs and the nymphs, and soldiers being tested by nymphs who prance about, being frolic types. Now, the giants is interesting because usually people would say the taller you are, the more manly you are. Women don't really pick short men unless they have to. And that shorter men are seen as kind of like thumpy dwarves who get picked on, and then more tall men have you want your man to be taller than you. And the giants coming from that is interesting because tall men have an effect on women. It's interesting when you see like a basketball player who's really tall goes next to a woman, and it's like they get very flustered in a good way of like, wow, he's so masculine, he's so tall, But when dwarves are around, women kind of have the, more just cutesy, it's a different type of energy. The taller you are, it's almost like the more women are drawn to you. So it is quite interesting how nymphs and giants have this sexual energy about them. Aphrodite as well, who's used by many women in reference in songs and such. There's products named after her, you name it. All of them came from a male organ. So the feminists who use Aphrodite and, who think girl power, it is kind of brutal in a sense of like the cutting of a male organ makes you come into being. But at the same time, Aphrodite still came from that male organ, which we know all men do. All humans, essentially, right? But it is just in this Greek mythos how that entity came about. And she is a figure of, smiles, deception, tenderness, sweet pleasure, stuff, whisperings, like girly whisperings. So she has this very, frolic type of intimacy energy going on with her symbolism as well. I mean, wow. Essentially, it's just by Kronos doing this act, him being born of a kind of a perversion, I'd say. He does an act of that to his own father to escape, and man, it is quite intense, I must say. What do you think? I mean, it is pretty tense, I must say. Also, what's unique is that she's called Aphrodite because she was formed in foam, which is Aphros and Kytheria, and she approached something in Kythera and Cyprus born. So eventually in Cyprus, it was very popular. And man, it's unique. What's unique further, though, is Medea kind of mentions genitals. And there's a play called Medea, And in that play Medea, it's pretty sad. She executes her 2 sons because her husband got a younger wife. I remember a long time ago I did a video on that. And so if you cut off the progeny of a man, you're essentially cutting off his genitals, his lineage. So it's really interesting when you start to break down the Greek words, because it seems they play a lot on our language today and how people talk to one another. We have references that we didn't even know we had, but that come from that. So, Kronos is definitely a figure who's really just out there, right? And remember that the hilariousness of the younger demigods having to outsmart the older. It's very, very strange. It's a take your power, essentially. The older ones don't surrender, you must take it. Wow. And getting older doesn't affect them. So the weird type of mental gymnastics that polytheists must do must give you a headache. No wonder why some Greek philosophers came from that time, because they're sitting around listening to these stories like, what? You know what I mean? Like, they probably had to start questioning, like, this is getting kind of bizarre, right?